Good afternoon, everybody. I hope we have a great audience for what's going to be a tremendously interesting session on peat and horticulture. We're talking about demonstrating success, and this session will provide an update on the diversity of solutions engaging with the Peat-free campaign, plus the view from industry. So I hope we're going to have a very lively debate, and I would encourage all the participants to have a lively debate in the chat. And indeed, there's a Q&A button. If you want to ask questions for all our speakers, please, use the Q&A button, put them in there, and we'll get the questions for the questions and answer session at the end. Now, before I introduce our first speaker, Jenny Hawley, who's going to speak to us live, I just want to run through the list of the speakers. So we have Jenny Hawley, the policy manager from Plantlife. She's going to speak first, and her presentation will be a live transmission. Then we have Paul Alexander is providing the technical support and product development manager with Bulrush Horticulture. Then we have David Denny, futures and sustainability manager with Horticultural Trades Association. Steve Harper, the CEO of Southern Trident. Steve, unfortunately, will not be able to join us for the Q&A panel, but nevertheless, he's making a presentation. Then we will have a live presentation from Mark Gush, who's the head of environmental horticulture for the Royal Horticultural Society. And then we have Ali Morse, who's the water policy manager with the Wildlife Trusts. And finally, I believe Diana Sammons for Pete's sake. So that's Diana at the end. And then following Diana's talk, we have a wonderful live Q&A session. There's not a hard stop, but we're going to try and finish us, in a prompt and easy time. But it depends how lively the debate is as to how far we go. So just to say that my name is Neil O'Brolacon, and I'm the policy. I'm in charge of policy with the EU Care Peat project. I'm based at the National University of Ireland in Galway, where I'm a researcher and a lecturer. And basically, in my previous life, I was in politics, so I have good experience of bringing forth policy. So I specialise in policy and evidence-based policy, data analysis, and e-government, and so on. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jenny Hawley, who, as I said, is the policy manager of Plantlife and Plantlife International. She's speaking up for wild plants, fungi, and their habitats with policymakers across the UK and internationally. She leads Plantlife's campaign for peat-free horticulture and will speak today about the need for action towards a legal ban. So that's quite an interesting talk. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over for 10 minutes to Jenny.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to set the context really for this really interesting lineup of speakers and just take stock of where we are on peat-free horticulture and the need to move towards a ban. So we have this from the Plantlife archives back from 1990, which was just a year after Plantlife was founded, and we launched a campaign to save peatlands, including encouraging people to buy alternatives to peat. And shockingly, this is now 30 years ago, and here we are. We're still not quite there yet. So I think it's just a reminder of how long this issue has been going on. And I know some of the people involved in this campaign have been working on it for almost that long. So this is Plantlife's Montsbury Reserve in the Flow Country in Scotland, which is a fantastic place for wild plants and fungi. And of course, I'm preaching to the converted here about the importance of peatlands, but just a reminder that they're not only important for their carbon and adaptation to climate change, but also water, flood risk management, and of course their biodiversity. So these are just a few of the beautiful plants that you can find there. And this is the site of peat extraction, so quite a contrast. And thanks to Ollie Watts for this photo. And I do want to just echo the frustration that Craig Bennett talked about on Monday morning, that we are still in a position after so long and so many commitments and so many targets set voluntarily, that this kind of activity is still continuing. And I find it perplexing that on the one hand, there's millions and millions of pounds going into peatland restoration, which we've heard about fantastic stories and work that's going on through this conference, and yet on the other hand, still allowing peatlands to be harvested and destroyed to feed this horticultural market. So we had new data last year from the horticultural markets, which has given us a good picture of where we are. So this graph just shows the volume of peat used and the trends over time since 2011. And you can see the total use and then the amateur line in the middle and the professional sector at the bottom. So there has been a decline since 2011. And we've gone down from 2.8 million cubic meters to 2.1 million cubic meters, I should say. So there is a decline, but again, it's just frustratingly slow. And as you can see, there's really just a plateau since 2013. The amateur sector is dominant, but the professional use of horticulture is really still a very significant part of the market. And peat still accounts for 47% of total growing media in the UK in 2019. So it has dropped, but it's still almost half of all the growing media. And worryingly, last year with the pandemic, we saw 9% more peat sold in 2020 than in 2019. Obviously, a rise in the popularity of gardening with people being at home, but also supply chain issues for some of the other materials. So peat filled that gap, is my understanding, but maybe we'll hear more about that later. So I think this just shows what a significant problem there is still, and the work that still needs to be done. So in terms of the policy context, as I say, we've had these repeated commitments to phase out horticultural peat by governments and by the industry, but targets have been missed over and over again. So most recently, last year, the target to phase out amateur use of peat by 2020 in England was clearly missed. But the context has changed very much. So in the past, it was driven very much by biodiversity goals, but of course now the climate crisis is upon us as well, and that's really driving the policy forward alongside the nature crisis. And this is the time to do it. If we can't do this now, then when can we? We've got legally binding net zero commitments, the UK's leadership and presidency of COP26. We are living with and adapting to climate change. I think we've really run out of time on this issue, and it's clear that we need to do whatever we can to mitigate and adapt to climate change. In the biodiversity world, we've got a new biodiversity framework which is emerging at the global level, and there will be new national nature strategies to deliver that. So again, it's a time of looking ahead and setting new targets for ourselves. So again, a good time. And with Brexit, obviously, markets have changed in the UK and the way that we trade, and our internal markets present opportunities and challenges that we can take advantage of. And we heard on Monday from the different governments and agencies their commitments to phase out peat from horticulture. And I've tried to summarise that in this table. And happy to be corrected if I've missed things out or not quite got it right. But this is my understanding of where we are. So on the extraction side, there's a fairly consistent view of not giving new or extended permissions for extraction. But I'm aware of cases, certainly in Scotland, where we are still fighting applications for extended licences, and there are still many extraction licences which will continue for many years to come. On the sales side, there are specific commitments by 3 of the administrations, but again, it still feels relatively limited, and we're not anywhere near actual legislation yet. So still a long way to go, really. And finally, I just want to talk about how we define phase out, because we talk about phasing out peat from horticulture quite a lot, and I think it's important to define the scope of that. So this is what I would propose from Plantlife, and I think we've been working with lots of different partners and NGOs about the need for this broad scope. So we need to tackle the sales and the use of peat in horticulture, but also the commercial extraction. And those two need to go along with each other, because if we ban sales but not extraction, then we'll continue to export peat to other countries and other markets. And if we ban extraction but not sales, then we'll continue to import for our own markets. So we need to have that twin track approach. We need to tackle the amateur and the professional sectors. So the DEFRA's proposed legislation for England is only applicable to the amateur sector, and we need to see a much clearer plan for professional sector phase out as well. And we really need these legal bans and the enforcement of those, and the resources and the support to make that happen. We've seen the voluntary targets and commitments not being met for many decades now, and we need to have those legal bans in place to create a level playing field for the industry and to make sure that it does happen in reality. We need this across the UK, to not just England, not just Scotland, but across the UK. And we need to tackle imports and exports of peat as well, so across the board. And I think here there's also an opportunity for international leadership on peat markets. I'd be interested to hear if there's other countries which have already phased out peat from horticulture. But this may be an issue where the UK can, and the devolved administrations can show that leadership and have an influence on peat markets in other countries and internationally to help save peatlands around the world. And finally, just a look towards sustainable alternatives, because of course we don't want to move and replace peat with other materials which might be equally damaging. So I think we'll hear more about the labelling scheme that's coming from the industry and the responsibility indexing of all materials that go into growing media, which is a really important move, so that we, again, make sure we're not replacing peat with more other damaging materials, but also so consumers know what they're buying. And I think we do need to see an evolution of the horticultural industry across the board to a greener gardening approach, to play a positive role and be part of the solution in tackling the nature and climate crises. So when I talk about greener gardening, I mean native species, less reliance on these raw materials, more recycling, home composting, and less plastics across the board, just taking that green approach. So I look forward to hearing from the other speakers and look forward to the debate. Thank you very much.
Sorry to the presenters. Thank you very much, Jenny. I suffer from pressing the mute button there, so I was speaking away happily, muted. Anyway, thank you very much to Jenny. Looking forward to hearing your questions and answers in the questions and answers session. Excellent presentation. I'd like to move on now, if possible, to Paul Alexander. He is the technical support and development or product development manager with Bulrush Horticulture. Just a few notes on Bulrush. Bulrush has offered full technical support, both with selection and use of substrates they produce. These include water analysis of long-term crops such as poinsettia, advisory visits, calibration services, sampling of growing crops, disease and pest problems, grower notes on crops, trials of new and existing products. And Paul tells me that he's responsible for the identification of non-peat materials and their use in professional substrates. So very much looking forward to your presentation, Paul, and indeed for questions and answers afterwards. And please, to all the audience, please keep those questions and answers coming in, and do use the chat. So thank you very much. If there's anything you hear in any of the presentations you want to ask questions about, please make sure you do. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Paul Alexander and I work for Bulrush Horticulture, and I'm going to talk to you about non-peat materials in commercial substrates. Bulrush do make some retail product, but primarily our business is commercial substrates, supplying directly to growers. A little bit of material history from our perspective of using non-peat materials. So you can go back to the early 90s when we first started using barks, hortifibre, a type of wood fibre, and clays. We moved on to adding composted chipboard waste to that list in the mid-90s. We switched from hortifibre to Teresa, early 2000s, trying to again get wood fibre to work for us. Koya in the early 2000s. We then moved on to our own wood fibre, Forest Gold, in mid 2000s. You'll notice 3 wood fibres on the list. Essentially, depending on how wood fibre is made, depends on what properties the material will have in a mix when you come to use it, let alone the costs of buying in finished wood fibre in the case of hortifibre and Teresa. The last material on the list is anaerobic digestate fibre, which we've been using since 2016. So currently we use bark, clay, Koya, our own wood fibre, and anaerobic digestate fibre. In terms of Forest Gold, our wood fibre, we use what's known as the steam expansion method. So wood chips are essentially steamed, conditioned and processed under pressure. The material is then pushed between 2 contra-rotating plates, shredded, and it produces a consistent sized product. Very not dissimilar to cotton wool in appearance. For us, the advantages are it's clean, consistent, predictable as a material in a mix, and it's cost competitive. The disadvantages: can't be used at more than 50% in a mix for most crops, and the challenge of competing with energy for that raw material of wood chip when energy is subsidised. For our customers, we've got different recipes for different crops, for different nurseries, for different growers, for different times of years. All these differences come down to kind of 2 main elements, which is the physical and chemical properties. In the days of peat-based mixes, physical properties were very easily managed because peat can be graded from very fine grade peat to very coarse grade peat. And in terms of the chemistry, peat tended to come in with a low chemical signature, which meant it was a case of adding nutrient to a mix. With non-peat materials, physical properties, many of the materials don't give you the option to grade, so you'll then end up having to blend materials together. And in terms of the chemistry, some come in with low nutrient content, some come in with medium to high nutrient content. It just affects how you can use them and where you can use them. Probably the biggest challenge, though, is working at low cost in a low margin industry. So moving on for kind of the more specific customer requirements, we've got customers who may take 100 cubic meters of material. It's equivalent of 100,000 litres. We've got some customers who are taking 20,000 cubic meters or more, which is 20 million litres. These customers need absolute consistency from 1 litre to the next, every batch, every day, every week, every month, every year. They are growing to very specific specifications for their customer, in many cases the retailer. So for instance, they may have to grow a plant so that in 6 weeks' time it has at least 5 flowers and is 20 centimetres tall. They are challenged to be consistent. We are subsequently challenged to be consistent. We have some growers who define their mix according to 10 parts per million nitrogen. These are quite precise demands. An interesting area of the business would be the traceability. We've seen this for a number of years in food-related crops, but increasingly it's coming into ornamental production as well. So how do we manage quality of raw materials? Any variation in raw material means we either can't use it or the costs increase as we have to process it, handle it differently. So in the case of Koya, we will do analysis per year per load. It's often bought 12 months in advance to make sure we have the material on the ground. In the case of AD, again, analysis per load, but we're very picky regarding the source. AD varies according to its feedstock. Some feedstocks lead to high nutrient status, other feedstocks lead to lower nutrient status. Forest Gold, it's an engineered product. It's very precise, very consistent. You manage the process, your output is great. And then bark, well, it's a managed composting process. Again, analysis per pile, bit of patience. We know what we're doing. We're also part of Responsible Sourcing Scheme, which is concerned about identifying better from poorer sources of materials with regards to a variety of properties. And in terms of our retail product, we're also signed up to the quality assurance part of responsible sourcing, because you can get responsible products, sustainable products that you just won't grow plants. In terms of the industry, what are our volume material requirements? Well, in 2020, the DEFRA HTA figures suggested we're about 5 million cubic metres of growing media used in the UK, of which about 2 million cubic metres is peat. We, in our business with our wood fibre, think we can probably replace about 50% of that with wood fibre, which leaves us of that 5 million cubic metres looking at 2.5 to 2 million cubic metres of other material. So what can it be? If it's not going to be peat, what's it going to be? Coir, good product, you can use it on its own, but it's expensive and it's a complicated supply chain. Anaerobic digestate, again, can be a good product if it's sourced properly, but it tends to be available in relatively low volumes because it's largely an on-farm sourced material. Bark can be tricky to get hold of. Green compost can be variable. Other materials, we're all looking at other materials. There's all sorts of weird and wonderful things out there. The challenge we have is that none of these materials are like-for-like replacements for peat. You can't just take peat out and put these materials in. There is an exhaustive process of showing that things still work. You know, for us, we'd say the time to bring a new material to market can take between 3 to 5 years. We're also looking primarily at waste stream materials, which presents challenges. Often you're first through the door, the material's available to you, but as soon as you show there's some value in it, the price starts to go up and other industries then show an interest. So if I had a crystal ball, what do I think the future is going to look like? Well, I think we'll be using multi-component mixes, often different materials blended in different ways. I think as an industry, for us as a manufacturer of growing media, for growers, we're going to have to learn to work differently with these mixes. I think there will be cost implications to the end customer, passed down the chain. I think we'll replace peat. I wouldn't like to say by when, because I think some of these materials perhaps aren't on the table at the moment, but I think we will replace peat. Thank you for your time.
Okay, managed to unmute my mic properly this time. Thank you very much indeed, Paul, for an excellent talk. And again, looking forward to your contributions during the questions and answers session. And just to remind people who are looking in, you can use the Q&A button to add in your questions for the Q&A session. And also, I believe people can vote for which questions they think are the most appropriate. So please do that. I'll be fully democratic. Anyway, I'd like to introduce our next speaker without further ado. That's David Denny. And David is the Futures and Sustainability Manager with the Horticultural Trades Association. So he's leading the HTA's programs on market and consumer insights in terms of data, sustainability roadmap, and forecasting futures for the UK horticultural industry. So without further ado, I'd like to invite David to give his talk. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Dave Denny. I work at the HTA looking after the association's work with our members on sustainability, in particular our 5-year sustainability roadmap and a cross-industry growing media task force looking at peat and other issues around sustainability in growing media. So today I'm going to talk to you about what the industry is doing in that area, and so much of it is really given by this construct of sustainability. It's about balancing people, planet and profit to ensure that we have a responsibly organised industry contributing to the communities, customers, employees that it serves, being commercially viable in order to be able to continue to do that, and above all, contributing to our planet, of which of course we only have one, and of which we have an absolute duty to conserve, protect and pass on in a better position than we found it. So one of the things that the industry is looking at for the 2022 season is educating retailers and consumers around responsible choices in growing media. Now, that can range from a number of areas, whether that's about picking the right product for the right purpose. It could also be around some of the issues around peat and indeed other components in growing media, and making sure that growing media is purchased, sold and used responsibly. Some findings from some recent consumer research that we did. Just over half of consumers in a report we ran last month with YouGov would welcome information on environmentally friendly compost. However, a similar proportion admit that they don't know much about how environmentally friendly compost is. So we will be working with retailers, with the wider industry, manufacturers and hopefully other willing partners to help our garden centres, our garden retailers give that good information at the point of sale about what purposes growing media can and should be used for, and some of the information needed to make responsible choices. Key to that is the work around material availability and suitability that the industry is doing, the centrepiece of which is the responsible sourcing scheme for growing media, which is a real innovation from the industry. It scores growing media components, peat, coir, wood fibre, on like-for-like bases to give an overall score for products. And by putting that sort of information in the hands of consumers, we're looking to really inform choice, but also to help the retailers to really inform consumers about what environmental and social benefits and impacts the products that they're purchasing and using have. We have a challenge in that we need to replace about 1.5 million cubic metres of peat in products for the consumers, and key to that is raising the profile of horticulture as an end market for industries that may have product suitable for that. Some of that can be available now, provided we get some access to things like sufficient quality garden waste and green compost from it, to wood fibre, to coir, but other things will take longer to come on a stream, such as sphagnum farming, which has some long-term potential, but we need willing partners to help accelerate the availability of that to us as an industry. And it's important as well that we take a component by component approach. Each of those components that I listed earlier have different chemical, physical properties. We need to take into account their relative effectiveness, how they perform in combination with each other, to make sure that gardeners continue to get a good experience, and that what we end up replacing peat with isn't actually worse in terms of kind of gardening experience or environmental or social impacts. And the work that the industry is gearing up to do is really about making sure that we're doing the right thing going forward. So if we're going to bring that together, why is the industry working in this way? Well, from the people point of view, we need to satisfy our customers, but we also need to satisfy other stakeholders as well. One of the things that motivates people to work in our industry, and it is an industry to be proud of, is the contribution that our plants, environment, gardening make to health, well-being and the environment. And so continuing the work in that, doing the right things there, are absolutely essential to keeping, retaining and recruiting more people into our growing industry. Regulatory costs are only going to rise for non-compliance, not only around growing media, but in terms of environmental considerations in general. Whether that be plastic taxes, extended producer responsibilities, increasing costs of carbon. To remain competitive and financially stable and sustainable, it is going to be in businesses' interest to do this. And we're seeing very, very significant work within the industry around making sure those supply chains are sustainable, and really doing that in order to meet consumers' needs as well as the regulatory environment. Lastly, we're an industry that cares passionately about the planet. We work with plants, we work with the land, and it is absolutely in the industry's DNA to want to do the right thing for this. There are so many benefits to be gained through any range of things from kind of carbon impacts through to social impacts through to biodiversity gain by looking quite forensically at the science behind our supply chain and working with willing partners to do the right thing. So really expect more from the industry in the coming years around that, and in particular next season. It's an exciting place to be, and we're really looking forward to taking some of these things forward. Thank you very much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, David. And again, looking forward to your contribution in the questions and answers session. Please keep those questions and answers coming in now. And we've got a lot of Q&A now to look forward to. And again, I'd ask the speakers maybe to have a look at the Q&A as well, because you can vote for the questions that you think are the most relevant. And if there are questions that you want to answer, please do vote for them so that we can bump them up, because we will take them in the order, of the democratic order, as it were. So I'd like to introduce now Steve Harper to you, who's the CEO of Southern Trident. He describes himself as a hugely driven director who has developed a career through sales and marketing with a strong background in operations and supply chain. And his ethos is to get the best out of a business. You must understand it from the ground up and then drive it to be better. And that's very appropriate for the subject we're talking about. Now, unfortunately, Steve will not be able to join us for the Q&A panel for his own reasons. But anyway, I'd like to invite Steve to make his presentation now. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Steve Harper, CEO of Southern Trident. And in the next 5 minutes, I will try and give you a producer's perspective. How does the industry gear up for the new long-term sustainable future, whilst avoiding the fragility of relying on a single product? To understand the issue, I think we need to look backwards to be able to look forwards. For many years, we relied as an industry on a single material, peat. Life in the main was relatively easy. We harvested vast quantities, we stockpiled it, and we cooled it off and used it as required. But even then we saw the risk of being reliant on a single material. If we had a poor harvest in one year, we struggled with supply the following year. For that reason, we created alternatives, so having alternatives is not new to us. As we now move away from peat, we have many more materials to use. Coir, green compost, composted bark and wood fibre, and that's before we consider the up-and-coming materials like anaerobic digestate. One could say we have already learnt an important lesson, that being not to rely on a single raw material. But, and I repeat but, we have multiple challenges. Growing media producers are aware of the challenges it is facing, but the wider industry, consumers, retailers, growers, government and NGOs need to be aware, and where possible assist the industry to deal with the challenges. Breaking these down, we have raw material availability. We have more than 2 million cubic metres of peat to replace. We need to use as wide a portfolio of raw materials and continue to invest in R&D. Currently, there is insufficient raw material to plug the gap. This challenge is exacerbated by competing industries. For all wood-based materials, we have to compete with both construction and biomass industries, both of which can pay more or get subsidies. Best use of material. To improve availability, we need to ensure we use the material wisely. An example of this is a large amount of growing media is used for improving consumers' soils. We need to educate consumers to use soil improver. For example, green compost and digestate are great for this job, and then we can reserve the more valuable materials like composted bark fines for growing. Planning. As an industry, we no longer just have this huge pile of raw materials ready to use. We have to plan, allowing for the composting process of green compost and bark, supply and manufacture of the wood fibre, shipping of coir. Material is simply not just on tap as it was before. Then there's cost. Peat was cheap. Every replacement material costs between 2 and 8 times the price of peat. consumers will have to pay more, and that's before we look at the recent rapid rises in haulage and packaging costs. Finally, product efficacy. The industry works incredibly hard to make great products, but there are challenges, and those include wood-based materials which can create challenges with nutrient drawdown. This not only affects efficacy, but in fact impacts on manufacturing efficiencies as well, where we have to make product more just in time. Finally, I thought I'd lay out where Koya stands in all of this, given after all, Southern Trident is a Koya company. Significant quantities are available. It is and will become an ever-increasing large part of the answer. On the upside, it is consistent, it's high quality, it produces great results, and it's the only material that can pretty much be used 100%. It is a little costly, especially while container prices are high, but in time it will fall more in line. Environmentally, it is a little misunderstood. People say things like it's shipped halfway around the world and it uses lots of water. But actually, if you consider it as a retail product in a garden centre, getting the Koya to the UK only accounts for about 5.5% of its carbon footprint. With regards to water, manufacturers are reducing their water usage by harvesting rainwater and recycling the water they do use. A number of companies are now also looking at using wind and solar as energy sources. We at Southern Trident look as far as we can to improving the environmental credentials of our product. Our product is peat-free. Our Koya is certified organic by the Soil Association. We are an inaugural member of the Responsible Sourcing Scheme for Growing Media, and this will become the benchmark for all growing media. And we are about to be certified as a carbon neutral company, offsetting carbon emissions by supporting a UN project to avoid methane emissions in India, where food waste and coconut waste are composted. As we and the rest of the industry move away from peat, I can assure you we are all doing our part to make the right environmental choices. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. An excellent discussion. Unfortunately, Steve will not be joining us for the Q&A, so thank you very much for your presentation. Just in terms of Q&A, I hope everybody is able to find their way to Q&A. Maybe one of the people in the background could just write into the chat how people can see the Q&A. I'm not sure how everybody can do that. But without further ado, we want to move on to another live presentation by Mark Gush, who's Head of Environmental Horticulture with the Royal Horticultural Society. He leads a team of technicians and scientists conducting scientific research into practical interventions that gardeners can apply to reduce their gardening footprint and improve environmental health and human well-being. Very much looking forward to Mark's talk. It's 15 minutes. Mark, the floor is yours if you're ready with your slides. Thank you. I'll let you take the floor.
Thank you, Neil, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm coming to you from RHS Wisley in Surrey, and today I'll be sharing some thoughts on the transition away from peat use in horticulture from the perspective of the RHS. The global events of the last year have obviously impacted severely on the health of society, but positively, they've also raised awareness of the threats to the environment that we're facing as a global family. I think that we're all aware of the anthropogenic causes of global change through increases in greenhouse gases and the resultant shift in climate and more extreme events in terms of temperature and precipitation. And I'm just showing here a few quick examples of those trends. They illustrate on the left rising levels of CO2 in the atmosphere and the resultant increases on the right in global average temperatures over time. So these trends combined with population increases and urbanization are resulting in increasing pressure on natural systems. And this is really being felt in terms of impacts on human health and biodiversity. And I'm sure I don't have to convince this audience of the importance of undisturbed peat bogs in mitigating some of these challenges and the incredibly valuable services that they provide in regulating hydrology, biodiversity, and carbon balances in the landscape. This year in particular, as has been mentioned already, the eyes of the world are looking to the UK with COP26 around the corner, as well as other initiatives such as the 25-year Environment Plan and the Net Zero 2050 objective. Of course, you'll also be familiar from what's been said before with the original targets set for transitioning away from peat use in horticulture for the amateur and the professional sectors, and how these are going. Not particularly well, not as well as hoped, but there have been some positive developments, and those driven particularly around the England Peat Action Plan. So what is the RHS perspective on the state of play? Well, for one thing, it's clear that the number of gardeners in the UK has risen dramatically during COVID and during lockdown. It's been increasing by approximately 3 million over this time period to an estimated 30 million gardeners now across the UK. Reflecting this, there's also been a significant increase in RHS members. Increases, in fact, of over 50,000 in the last 6 months, which has brought the current total of RHS members up to approximately 574,000. As could be expected, this has resulted in increased demand for growing media. And at the same time, thanks to publicity and campaigns across a range of supportive charities and NGOs, there's been a more widely recognised need to transition to peat-free horticulture across the industry. The upshot of this is that a growing number of gardeners are looking for peat-free growing media alternatives and good advice. There's been a change in mindset that has started, and this needs to be nurtured and encouraged, preferably by means of the carrot as opposed to the stick, if you'll forgive the horticultural analogy there. So to that end, the RHS has been very active with messaging around the transition to peat-free horticulture. Earlier this year, the RHS committed to be 100% peat-free across all its operations by 2025. This is an ambitious target, and it's wider than just stopping sales of any bagged peat at its retail and garden centres, obviously. This includes eliminating any use of peat across all its gardens and shows, and this has implications clearly for upstream supply chain as well. The RHS position statement on peat is available online, and it's there in the presentation. So providing appropriate gardening advice to RHS members and the general public is obviously a key mandate of the RHS. It handles over 100,000 individual advice queries each year and over 20 million hits to its web pages per year. So for growing media related queries, that advice obviously promotes peat-free media and techniques with helpful information available on the RHS website about that. There's also obviously been extensive media engagement around peat-free horticulture, including press releases and coverage on actions lobbying government and ministers to speed up this transition. The RHS shows has a policy on peat, and this has also been updated to exclude its use on show stands. And this is a message that will also be going out at the RHS COP26 garden, which is actually on display at Chelsea, which starts next week, Monday. This will be the first ever, of course, Chelsea flower show to take place in September. So something unique about that event. Another very significant RHS event, which took place in June this year, was the opening of Hilltop, the home of gardening science, at Wisley. This amazing building and its 3 surrounding gardens. So you can see some images there. That's the wildlife garden, the well-being garden, and the world food garden. Together, it's been an absolute magnet for visitors since opening. It's promoting the diverse benefits of gardening, obviously, for people and the environment. And as part of that, it's also showcasing some examples of responsibly sourced growing media. There is an extensive public engagement and interpretation area called the Atrium within this new building. And this has an exhibit showing coir, wool, wood products, green compost, and anaerobic digestate, just as examples of some alternative raw materials to peat. And there's messaging to support this. these products and the transition away from peat. The RHS carried out a survey in March this year, asking non-RHS member gardeners about their opinions on compost, growing media, and their approaches to using it. There were over 2,000 responses to the survey, and it was designed to be very similar to one carried out by the RHS in 2013, which had approximately 1,000 responses at that stage. So that some trends over time could be assessed, and the results of this most recent survey threw up some really revealing findings. Encouragingly, over 80% of the 2021 respondents voiced concern about the environment, compared to just 30% of respondents in 2013. So that awareness has clearly grown over time. 37% confirmed that they only used peat-free compost. So it's okay, it's not good enough yet. While those that did use peat-containing compost cited price and accessibility as the main barriers to not switching. These are obviously realities for many people. Worryingly, 57% of the 2021 respondents admitted that they were uncertain or unaware of what their potting compost actually contained. Nevertheless, there was strong evidence that consumption of bagged potting compost has increased considerably, with more than half of the 2021 respondents indicating that they purchased more than 5 50-litre bags in the last year, compared to just 8% doing this in 2013. In terms of use of the potting compost, the majority of respondents, 76%, used it in pots and baskets, as would be expected, and 75% also used it for seed sowing. However, the fact that 51% of respondents also used it as a soil improver was of concern, because there are obviously other soil conditioning products, as well as homemade compost, particularly, which are much more effective for this purpose. So the use of potting compost in this inappropriate way really increases demand unnecessarily on this precious resource and puts additional pressure on its supply. And this is clearly an area where some stronger messaging and advice is needed. On the positive side, 92% of respondents indicated that they ideally wanted their gardens to be peat-free, which is great. And 81% carried out some form of home composting. Again, really encouraging. We need to move more in that direction. And this, of course, assists in alleviating some of the supply challenges that are currently represented by the over 2 million cubic meters of peat, which is used annually. So just looking ahead, there are a few more relevant activities where the RHS is involved in related to the move from towards a peat-free horticulture industry. I'd just like to highlight the partnership between RHS and Melcourt with licensing and endorsement of their range of peat-free growing media products. And this has really been a success story. It's been a win-win for both RHS and Melcourt, because obviously sales of the product have increased, while the RHS has also been happy to be associated with a quality peat-free brand. The RHS also recently initiated the Germination Trial at Wisley of Sarracenia flava, the pitcher plant, a carnivorous species, and this trial has established these carnivorous species in a range of different peat-free growing media compositions to look at germination under those conditions. The RHS is represented on a number of horticultural bodies, such as the Ornamental Horticulture Roundtable Group, which it chairs, and initiatives such as the NGO Charities Coalition that Jenny mentioned earlier, supporting the transition to peat-free. These have provided really good opportunities to influence a wider sphere of industry and government about, among other things, the transition to peat-free horticulture. Just this week, the launch of the RHS Planet-Friendly Gardening Campaign and a very ambitious sustainability strategy for the Society took place at Parliament on Monday this week. There's been a lot of media coverage of this, and both this campaign and the strategy include promotion of and a commitment towards a peat-free horticulture industry. So it's kind of embedded in, in strategy at this stage. The major challenge, as Paul has pointed out, of course, is to address the use of over 2 million cubic meters of peat annually in horticulture. And this can be approached by either increasing supply of responsibly sourced alternative raw materials, or by reducing demand on specialized growing media products, or a combination of the two. So encouraging gardeners to try and produce alternatives such as home compost, together with good advice on appropriate and sensible use of different types of growing media on the market, will assist in reducing this demand and also alleviating pressure on the resource. Obviously, more research and government support is needed to identify and test responsibly sourced alternative raw materials, and this is not a quick process, as Paul mentioned. And so there is a need for that, but it's great that the responsibly sourced scheme for growing media is forging ahead, and this will be really useful going forward. So some final thoughts, just really to acknowledge the continued importance of good communication and advice to the gardening public, leading by example whenever possible. And there is evidence now that there is behavioural change happening, which is really encouraging, and it flows from perception changes really about the use of peat in horticulture, as well as obviously practical considerations around supply and performance of peat-free alternatives. As always, evidence-based findings from research are vitally important to convince the gardening public of the need for and the benefits of peat-free horticulture. So these are just some thoughts moving forward. So that's it from me. Thank you for the time.
Wonderful. I hope you can hear me now. I hope everybody can hear me. That was Mark Gush, the head of the Environmental Horticulture unit from the Royal Horticultural Society. I noticed that there's a lot of voting going on with the various different questions. Keep those questions coming in, the Q&A. You can apparently see them on the main website. If you can't find them, please just look at the website, and I think you'll find the links to that. We're moving on anyway with Ali Morse, who's the Water Policy Manager with the Wildlife Trusts, and leading on policy related to all things watery, she says, including wetland habitats such as peatland. She is behind the Wildlife Trust's recent focus on peat in compost, and sits on the ENGO England Peat Policy Group alongside some of the other panellists who are here today. And this provides a forum for environmental organisations to work collaboratively on policy issues surrounding peat and peatlands. So I'm looking forward to Ali's presentation, and indeed to both Mark and Ali's questions and answer session involvement later on. So I'd like to hand over to Ali for her presentation. Thank you, Ali.
I'm Ali Morse, Water Policy Manager at the Wildlife Trusts, and I'm going to talk about the background to the Wildlife Trust's recent peat-free survey of retailers and some of the implications of that survey. Conservationists and campaigners have long called for an end to the use of peat by the horticultural sector, in recognition of the importance of peatland habitats for biodiversity. And some of the earliest targets calling for an end to this use stemmed from that interest in protecting biodiversity. In 1999, the UK Biodiversity Action Plan set out proposed actions which would see 40% of total market requirements for horticulture being provided by peat-free products by 2005 and 90% by 2010. And those targets were failed, but the Natural Environment White Paper, published by the UK government in 2011, built from those initial aspirations and set out a series of more explicit milestones, including that public sector procurement should be peat-free by 2015, and that the horticultural sector should look to deliver a voluntary phase-out of sales of peat composts to amateur gardeners by 2020, and a complete end to the use of peat by 2030. The White Paper recognised not only those initial biodiversity aspirations, but also the importance of peatland habitats as significant stores of carbon in our fight against climate change. And the recognition of the importance of peatlands in climate change mitigation and adaptation has increased significantly since that time. In its latest report to government, the Climate Change Committee expanded on its earlier ambitions, setting out that it now believes we need to restore 100% of upland peatlands by 2045, to re-wet and sustainably manage a significant proportion of lowland peat under crops or under grassland, and to restore all sites where peat was previously extracted by 2030 if we are to meet our UK net zero aspirations. So collectively, these targets and commitments make it clear that it won't be sufficient simply to end the extraction of peat in the UK and source all of our horticultural requirements from abroad. Instead, we need to move away from the use of peat in the horticultural sector completely in order to meet our climate and biodiversity aspirations. The Growing Medium Monitor was established in order to chart that falling use of peat by the horticultural sector, and peat use is indeed falling within the sector, but perhaps not as quickly as many would like. In 2011, the industry used 2.8 million cubic metres of peat as a growing medium, and by 2019 that number had fallen to 2.1 million cubic metres. This is a significant and welcome decline, both in terms of the overall volume and also the proportion of growing media that is made up of peat, which fell below 50% for the first time that year. But to put this in context, 2.1 million cubic metres is still a significant volume, and the peat used by the sector in 2019 would have been almost sufficient to fill the London Millennium Dome. So there is a major piece of work for the sector to move away from its reliance upon peat. In 2019, around 2/3 of the peat use by the horticultural sector was in the retail market, meaning peat sold to gardeners as peat compost. In this market, peat made up around 40% by volume of the growing media sold in that year. And over the course of the study, that percentage had decreased by an average of around 2% per year, meaning that at the current rate of change, peat sales would not cease for another 2 decades. The remaining third of peat use was by professional growers, meaning peat used to grow plants. And it will be even more challenging to move away from that use of peat. So the sector is facing some significant challenges going forward. To that end, the Wildlife Trust decided to repeat a previous survey of peat retailers. We wrote to a number of retailers at the end of 2020 at around the time when they would be determining what items they were going to be stocking in the coming year. We asked about their peat policy. Do they have a policy on peat? Do they have any established targets to reduce or eliminate the sale of peat composts and other peat-containing products? And what were their particular plans for 2021? We then asked in more detail about their peat compost and their peat in plants. In terms of compost, we wanted to know about the proportion of their compost sales that are currently peat-free and whether they predicted that that would increase. And we asked about the product lines that they plan to stock in 2021. In terms of plants, we also asked about the peat-free lines that they stock, what proportion of their current sales this makes up, and the type of plants that are available grown peat-free. And as I said, this was a repeat of a previous survey. The Wildlife Trusts previously wrote to a small number of national supermarket and DIY chains asking about their peat products. And this was part of a project funded by DEFRA, where we worked with other environmental organisations to raise awareness about the impacts of peat use in horticulture. At that time, the results of our survey were published in our leaflet, Where to Buy Peat-Free Products. And as you can see from the images on the screen, this now looks somewhat dated because we first undertook this work in the early 2000s. So we thought it would be extremely interesting to repeat and expand the survey and look at how the ambitions of retailers had changed since that time. This time, however, we expanded the number of retailers that we wrote to. We contacted again a number of national DIY and supermarket retailers, but we also wrote to a number of garden stockists. We were not able to access information about the volume of compost that these retailers sold, so instead we based our decision on the number of stores that they had and their online presence, writing to what we considered to be 20 major retailers of peat compost and other peat products to ask about their ambitions for 2021 and beyond. And the response to our survey was somewhat variable. A number of retailers did reply to our questionnaire. A number of others issued us with a statement, and a number further did not provide a response to our letters. In April of this year, around Easter, we were able to issue a press release highlighting the results to our survey. And this showed that only 2 of the retailers that replied at the time had set a date for ending their peat compost sales, and only 1 of those had committed to ending those sales this year. A number of other retailers had said they were committed to phasing out peat completely, but they gave no date by which they would be able to end their sales of peat compost. However, in the months that have followed, a number of further retailers have also made commitments to ending peat compost sales. In the How to Go Peat-free pages on the Wildlife Trust's website, we have a table showing the commitments made by the retailers currently, as far as we know. And as you can see at the top, we have the Royal Horticultural Society and the Co-op, whose compost sales are already peat-free. Travis Perkins and Dobbies have committed to ending peat compost sales this year, and Waitrose, B&Q and Wix have also set dates by which they intend to end their peat compost sales. What this table doesn't show, however, is a number of complexities that sit behind this information. Firstly, we don't know about the volume of peat compost currently sold by these retailers. For those which are not currently selling large volumes of peat-containing composts, it will be somewhat easier to make the switch. But for those that do sell large volumes of peat-containing composts, they may well face the challenge of either having to go against their published commitments or to simply reduce their overall volume of sales if they're not able to source sufficient volumes of peat-free alternatives, which may well be a challenge given current supply chains. Also, this table focuses on the sale of peat composts, and a number of these retailers also sell plants grown in peat, and we know that moving away from this is going to be an even greater challenge for the sector going forward. But those retailers, plant growers and compost producers are going to have to face these challenges fairly shortly, because later this year we expect government to issue a consultation on ending the use of peat in horticulture. We understand that this is going to contain a proposal for ending the sale of peat compost, certainly within the life of this Parliament, and a further proposal to end the use of peat by the horticultural sector overall. Over 40,000 people have already signed the Wildlife Trust's petition calling on ministers to progress a ban on peat-based products. And the Wildlife Trust and other environmental organisations would like to see an immediate end to the sale of peat composts and an end to the use of all peat in horticulture by 2025. We of course recognise that this is going to be particularly challenging for the sector, but we believe that it's crucial in our fight against climate change and in reversing biodiversity declines in what is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Ali. Excellent. Excellent discussion. We're now going to our last speaker. So it's your last chance really to get those Q&A in, or indeed to vote for them, to push them up or down or whatever way you want to do it. But our final speaker is Diane Sammons for Peat's Sake. So Diane is obviously a campaigner, and she is, for Pete's sake, has said that the use of peat in compost is causing huge amounts of damage to important biodiverse peatlands. And peat obviously is a vital carbon sink. Its extraction contributes to climate change. Our planet and our wildlife need garden centres to change their ways. They need the garden centres to change their ways. And they're asking people to demonstrate consumer demand by asking them to only stock peat-free compost. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Diane, who's our final speaker, and then we're looking forward to a very robust and very lively questions and answer session. So over to you, Diane.
Hi, it's great to be here as part of this really significant conference. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm now going to share just a few of the things that are highly impactful work that some of the grassroots groups are doing, some of them many that I can't begin to capture, but you'll know of our Garden Organic. Repeat's a youth collective, does some amazing work. Peat-free April, busy early in the year, and this is the group that I belong to, for Pete's sake. So over this last year, we've been, extraordinary year of course, we've been galvanising the national actions that have been happening from the bigger groups. For Pete's sake, have been busy writing letters to councillors and metro mayors, inviting them to divest from all things peat. Garden Organic has been launching its Be Proud and Peat-free pledge. There's been 867,000 Twitter impressions during the month of April for Peat-free April. There's teachers I've heard of who are writing new materials for the geography syllabus in schools. So many great events and festivals online. The last one I really enjoyed and got so much from was the Repeats Peat Fest. Fantastic. The grassroots groups have been invited to join the NGO Peat Alliance, which has really helped us to be more impactful and draw on their support and guidance. You might have heard of Nick Wilson's really informative and useful website that shows how many nurseries and garden centres are now peat-free. And we've been behind 2 petitions to the English and Welsh government to ban the use of horticultural peat by 2023. So here they are, some of them. This is Pete's sake's pledge to be peat-free and proud. This is Nick Wilson's great, useful map of where the peat-free nurseries are, and this is our celebration of the large retailers who pledged to go peat-free and went by. So we know that small grassroots groups can influence people, can make a difference, and can lead to deep, radical change. Those tiny pushes can end up being more than the sum of their parts. So we're based in the community and we are in there putting flyers up, posters, and just personal connections can make a big difference. Just a conversation with your neighbour or down at the village shop. The eco-artists bring people along with them with their visionary, inspiring artworks. Pumpkin Beth doing some brilliant peat-free compost trials. So we know that convincing, impactful behaviour spills over to other people, being seen to be doing the right thing. And then there's the gentle activism, one stitch at a time. So here's a good example. a garden with big influence for everybody who walks past it. And here again are some boring buttons been transformed into peat-free badges. Just a flyer communicating to people just raises their awareness. So I'm going to leave you now with the eco-artist Kate Foster's beautiful charm for all peat enthusiasts everywhere, the sundew. So we've shared our some things. Maybe you'd be happy to share some of the things that you've been doing alone or with others. There's a place for you to share them, and that's the address. I shall also put it in the chat. Thank you. I'll leave you with this. All the best.
Very good, for Pete's sake. So we're going to move on with what I hope is going to be a very lively and robust panel discussion. So you have been letting, the audience is fantastic because there's some tremendous questions coming in. There's been a lot of voting as well. So when I last looked at it, which was a few seconds ago, it is very dynamic. The question that came up that was up at the top was the following. It's a question to substrate producers. And basically it says, which raw material has high potential to be used to substitute peat in addition to wood fibre? What about sphagnum farming and cattail grows on re-wetted peat? And that's a question. So does anybody want to, I look for the speakers to basically put their hands up. I'm going to, we have Paul putting his hands up. So what we're looking for is just examples of materials that can substitute for peat. And you might address some of the other questions as well, such as things like cost and things like what are the barriers and so on. So Paul, you'll have to unmute your microphone and maybe you can give us an answer, and we'll open it to the floor then.
Thank you, Noel. I think it's a really interesting discussion. It's a really complicated discussion. There are lots of materials out there with potential. The challenge is showing, being able to technically perform as a growing media is one thing, but being able to do it for commercial production is another. I know there are manufacturers out there exploring options with sphagnum. We are interested in sphagnum. There are challenges with sphagnum, and I'm not saying any of this is insurmountable. One of the problems, I think one of the issues with sphagnum is you can't harvest it annually. I think it's on a 3-year cycle or something. Therefore, the land area you need to give over to sphagnum farming grows and grows and grows. And maybe that links in with a politiculture policy. And we've certainly been involved in discussions with DEFRA over elements like that. But some of the more fundamental challenges you get with sphagnum, and I've heard this from on the continent, is weeding. How do you reduce? We get claims against us as a manufacturer for weeds in crops. So and there are companies on the continent using radiation to try and manage the weed content and kill off the weed content. And I think we end up in this cycle of we think we take a step forward with something that's sustainable, and other problems just come along and in that bigger picture.
Paul, if the government were to do as was suggested here today by Jenny and others, to ban the use of peat, could we upscale sphagnum? How long would it take us to upscale things like sphagnum to really replace that? Could we do it at all, ever?
I think sphagnum is still at an R&D scale. So you'd have to get the farmers buy-in to convert them into sphagnum farming. There's been a lot of work in Germany at Greifswald on sphagnum farming, and I think it's a slow process. I think you're looking at a 10-year window to get something like sphagnum into it. I'm not saying it can't happen, and it could happen more quickly, but the challenge is we're quite a fragmented industry and quite a small industry. Centralized R&D kind of gets a bit a bit difficult when you're working with commercial companies because everybody wants the commercial advantage, of course, and so it becomes a bit difficult. We do talk to each other, and I think, I still think we have opportunities with wood-based materials, because I just think the volumes and the ease of access make it more realistic in a shorter time frame. But it's for us, it's the end customer and the complexity of we supply to obviously commercial growers. It's an international trade. One of the areas that they are really worried about is young plant production. A huge amount of young plants come in as peat grown from the continent.
Yeah, but is it realistic to talk about things like using wood and indeed, sphagnum farming to substitute for the huge volumes of peat which are used at the moment? Is that even remotely realistic to do that in a reasonable timescale?
I think I said in my presentation, the future is going to be multi-component mixes. So I think we have to move away from this idea. We can take peat out and put something else in. I think we can take peat out and we will use 4 or 5 materials at a time. And we'll see a cost implication. But if you split it evenly, 20% for each of the materials, suddenly the volume of material required becomes a bit more achievable, et cetera, et cetera. And then, we as an industry can blend and get the best out of those things. And maybe Koya plays a part. Okay.
I want to go to Jenny and then David. I want to hear as many voices as possible on this one. Jenny, you want to ban all this. So, I mean, is this realistic at all?
Well, I just think, it's really interesting to hear, and I'm not an expert on growing media in the sense that Paul is, but I just think it's really symptomatic of our food industry, and what we see in other aspects of farming and food production is that the kind of technicalities of these intensive industries has become quite divorced from our natural processes and ecosystems, and these very kind of harsh and specific demands that the retailers and the supply, the manufacturers put on the producers. And I think that all needs to change. We need to kind of come to a food and farming system which is much more harmonious and in tune with our natural systems. And this is just one symptom of that. So I really kind of took to heart what Paul said about we can't just replace like for like. We need to look at transforming the industry. And I'm really encouraged by some of the other comments we've had today, that we need to find a different way of doing things and a different way of producing food and being less reliant on these very kind of strict requirements which are not going to be realistic.
Yeah, so you see it as a process rather than just a sort of blanket ban. It's a process that's going to happen over time. But can I ask you, has that process started?
Well, I hope so. I don't know. There's a lot of discussion going on about, our food and farming system. We've got a national food strategy underway. So, there's a much bigger debate here. And I think that was, my point at the end about wanting to see that transformation in the horticultural industry to be part of the solution for nature and climate and for a sustainable food system. But and this is not as if it's happening overnight. We've been talking with the horticulture industry about phasing out peat for 30 years now. So I don't think anyone can say that it's been rushed through. We do need to get on with it.
let's go to David of the Horticultural Trades Association and see what his view on this is. Is this possible, David? Is it desirable? Is it possible?
I find myself agreeing with both Paul and Jenny, actually. I think it's not as simple as saying there's 2 million cubic metres of peat. What one thing can we stick in as quickly as possible because of all the issues I won't rehearse again. But I think it is that multi-component piece and multiple bits across the supply chain. So there are alternatives, sphagnum, sheep wool, comfrey, bracken. There's many novel materials as well as the existing ones. There's a number of kind of challenges about how you bring those on stream, as Paul says, on commercial scale. That's about performance within the mix, but it's also about supply chain. How do you get those components to the right places in a kind of carbon cost efficient way? And so I think the answer is almost certainly yes. Is it doable? I think the scale of time it will take depends on the level of kind of collaboration we get across the industry and with government and NGOs that can help connect us up with that alternative sources.
Okay, so suffering from the mute problem there again. Sorry about that. I'd like to move on if I may. I mean, I want the other speakers to come in, but just a very interesting question has risen to the top now, which is, what are the key actions to support the new sustainable gardening industry? Upscaling availability of materials, e.g. policy to encourage sphagnum growing, EA waste regulations, a number of suggestions there. Organic materials and its use as a valuable commodity. Does anybody have any sort of views as to what are the key components? What are the key things, the key actions that need to take place? I mean, is it a case of better government policy? Is it a case of Jenny's sort of outright ban? Is that something we should be calling for now? David, do you want to come back in on this? Or, in fact, sorry, let's go to Mark, because Mark hasn't spoken yet. I want to bring in all of the speakers, and I think Dan, did you indicate there? Yeah, so we go to Mark and then Diana.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, I think there's a groundswell of appreciation of the need for the world to move more to sustainable living and sustainable industries. And from the horticultural perspective, the more that people can produce their own resources in the available spaces that they have to them, and recognizing that this is not always possible. People may have limited garden or green space, but if they can use what space they have, even if it's allotment space, to home compost and use the space that they have to produce the resources that they need as much as possible. Harvesting rainfall is another one. Reducing reliance on mains water. That will go a considerable way to just reducing pressure. And I think it was David Attenborough that said, waste nothing. The more we can have a mindset about resources are precious, and the more we can use them with increasing efficiency and effectiveness and minimize wastage, I think the better for everyone.
Great. Sorry, let me get this right. It's Diane rather than Diana. Is that right? Yeah. Probably a princess anyway. But what are your views on? Anyway, what are your views on this particular question? What do you think are the key components that need to be put in place?
It was interesting. I was just going to say what Mark has just taken out of my mouth, actually, about not forgetting about how important home composting is and education about that. And it was really interesting. I was having a conversation with somebody in an open gardens event and asking her, does she home compost? And she said, I do, but it's really interesting. Since the green bin garden scheme that councils have implemented in most of the counties, people in her street, a lot of them have stopped composting because they put all of their garden waste into green bins. I'd never thought of that before. So I'm not saying that it wasn't a good strategy, but it's really interesting that she noticed significant amount of people not composting anymore. So I do think it's very important, and reiterating exactly what Mark had said, it's education, and it can be happening. It's happening all the time, certainly on Gardeners World, but the message needs to get across much quicker.
Yeah, what happens to that garden waste that they put into those bins? Because certainly I was involved in that at a local authority level in a past life. And, what happened initially was that the compost that came from gardens and so on, or the waste that came from gardens was turned into compost, and people were entitled actually to come and pick it up and use it themselves, but that seems to have gone by the wayside. I mean, is it that sort of policy? And I mean, I notice another one of the questions is talking about planning policy. So, I mean, is it maybe at a local level that we need to be a bit more proactive with alternatives? Yeah, no, please go on, Dan.
Yes, I think it's different across different counties from what I know. I know Norfolk still on some places within Norfolk are still making it available, and people are using it for a small amount of money. Lancashire used to do, where I live, but isn't doing at the moment. So yeah, I think it's patchy, and I think it could be. That's why we've been writing to the councils and asking them to encourage to bring this back in.
Yeah, so maybe incentives at local authority level is something that could be done by the government. I want to bring Ali in because Ali hasn't spoken yet, but just particularly in terms of the role of NGOs and what you think. Just to get back to the original question, I mean, how do you think NGOs can play a role in terms of putting together suggestions in this regard? Because I think NGOs are very powerful if they choose to be. But quite often they tend to just stick in their corner. But you're bringing a collection of NGOs together, I noticed from your profile. And, I mean, how is that working out? And what do you think needs to be done?
Yes, that's right. Thanks, Niall. I certainly think the role of environmental organisations in helping to raise awareness is particularly important. I thought the results of the gardener survey that Mark was talking about earlier was really interesting. The number of people that don't really know what's in the potting mixes that they're buying. So that suggests that people are not always buying peat because of a preference for peat. They're just buying whatever happens to be on the shelves. And so I think a sort of awareness raising role for the environmental organisations is particularly important. And I think that needs to cover both sides of the picture, not just why we shouldn't be using peat from an environmental, a biodiversity, a climate perspective, but also what are the alternatives that we can be using instead. And so on that front, I would second the vote for home composting. Again, not just to move away from the use of peat, but also because of the biodiversity benefits, the benefit it has for wildlife in your own garden. So I think there is a lot of information out there already about the ways that you can home compost, and I think helping to sort of marshal some of that and make sure it's available to people is an important role. But I think also the role of the environmental NGOs in helping to trial and promote some of these more novel alternatives to peat compost is really important. So, for example, a number of wildlife trusts are involved in trials of Horticultural, where, for example, in the Great Friend Project, we have wildlife trusts there working with farmers to look at the growth of sphagnum moss as an alternative to peat compost. And the interesting side of that is that it's not just fulfilling the need to move away from the use of peat as a compost. It's also looking at what we can do on the peat soils that are currently being farmed for vegetables and other crops in a rather unsustainable way that's requiring a lot of drainage works and so on. And this damages the structure of the soil, it releases CO2. It leaves the soils really dry and vulnerable to erosion. And so using these soils for alternative crops instead, like sphagnum and like other wetland crops, is playing a great part in improving the health of these soils, as well as providing an alternative to peat compost.
Great, thank you very much, Ali. I'd like to sort of. I noticed we have about 2 to 3 minutes left, and I don't know if speakers can remain beyond that. I believe we're allowed to move beyond that if we wish. But I want to quickly sort of address the money issue, because I notice a number of people have talked about this. There's one person talking about getting away from the £10 bags of, or £10 sterling bags of peat compost and so on. But generally, the question is peat too cheap? Obviously, if you're just scraping stuff and taking it from nature, it might be incredibly valuable from a nature point of view, but it's obviously a much easier process than growing sphagnum and processing it and doing all sorts of things, or indeed processing wood. Is it a case that the government needs to take action to sort of equalise that, to make peat more expensive? Because there is obviously a huge cost to the environment, to all of us, and indeed to the planet in terms of this, but maybe it's just not factored in. Maybe there needs to be something done from a financial point of view in order to equalise the situation. I mean, I don't know if anybody has any expertise in that area, but these questions are coming. Is peat too cheap? Does anybody want to address that? We have David, and then Paul, and then Jenny.
I think briefly, peat being cheap is certainly no longer the case. I'm sure Paul would attest to that. There's a ban in kind of extraction from the Republic of Ireland, and so that kind of classic price, cost demand is playing out. So I think the view that peat is far cheaper than the alternatives is less and less the case. To the other end of that supply chain, there's about 1 million consumers out there who buy compost who on a household income of less than £10,000 a year. So whilst those small movements in the overall market view, it's tempting to see it in terms of macroeconomic impacts. But gardening, Mark made the point, it's 30 million gardeners out of there. One of the things that we want to make sure is that those kind of artificial interventions in a market don't price people out of gardening by trying to make it artificially expensive. I think we need to look at cost-effective ways of getting more sustainable materials into the supply chain per se, rather than trying to take blunt instruments that might have very real, very unintended consequences.
Yeah, just that you mentioned the Republic of Ireland, I can't resist this little story of, that just the other day I got a call from a public servant who was telling me that in the last half hour he'd seen 10 trucks basically going from a peatland site in Ireland, ostensibly illegally. They go over the border to Northern Ireland and then ship it over to the various places over there. I know the same problem in places like Latvia in relation to Germany and so on. I mean, it's one thing on the ground. I mean, is there a case for sort of customs or something to do that? I'm just raising that question. The reality is that there's a danger, with too stringent financial penalties of creating a sort of black market. So obviously other measures might need to be brought in. Sorry, I'm just ranting here. I want to go over to Paul with the original question, which is just, is peat too cheap?
Yeah, I'd agree with what kind of David said. I think historically, the industry located itself on peat bogs, so it immediately reduced inbound haulage, and haulage is an absolute killer. So as life has gone on, peat has kind of got cheaper and cheaper. But David's right, the ban on the Republic, regardless of illegal or whatever harvesting operations, has made a significant impact on the price of peat, which is rising because availability is falling. Traditionally, you were looking at non-peat materials being 3 or 4 times the price of peat. So, it is evening up, but some materials are still astronomically more expensive. Waste stream materials inevitably need processing, and processing means cost. And one of our worries is, we work with commercial growers who work on, everyone's working on pretty low margins and struggling to make their businesses work. And then when you look at a plant on a nursery, the plug plant is usually the most expensive component at the start, then the plant pot, and then the substrate. So once you start realizing where the value is, you suddenly start to realize what low margins some of us are kind of trying to work within. It's challenging. Yes, there's economies of scale, and this is not a bleeding heart exercise, but it is a difficult business to try and make work for growers who are pinched by retailers as well.
Okay, Jenny, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, obviously peat is too cheap, and I wonder, how much people just buy compost unnecessarily and just think, well, if you want to grow some, have a nice garden, then you need to go to the garden centre and buy all these products in plastic packaging. Whereas actually, to make it more accessible to people, we need to be encouraging more of the home composting and swapping seeds and swapping plug plants with neighbours, and those community initiatives which are happening all over the country already. And of course, the industry is in the business of selling things to people, so it's not something that industry will do, but that's a role for NGOs, I think, and community groups as well. So Plantlife obviously promotes native wildflower gardening as well, and and those plants don't need very rich soils, and they can't tolerate rich soils and high fertility. So, and of course, we don't want to see pesticides and these other products going in there. So I think we need to make the shift to, certainly in amateur gardening, to a more just a lower input and more sustainable kind of community-based model for gardening. Obviously, there's different challenges for the professional sector, but I think that market value, and it's interesting to hear the changing sort of cost of peat. But I think we've spent a long time looking at these different market measures and voluntary measures and trying to persuade people, and that's why we're really putting the emphasis now on a ban, because this has been going on for so long. I think we've run out of time really to be kind of making these slight adjustments to the market. We need to be moving much more quickly to phasing it out, and hopefully that signal of a ban, like we've seen with ending combustion engines in cars. Who would have thought that would happen 10 years ago? And here we are. So I think we need to make that shift and have that signal from government that the ban is coming, and then we will all have to adapt.
Yeah. I see Diane nodding her head. I don't know if that means that she wants to say something, but she's more than welcome. But I think we kind of need to wind it up, but I'd like to finish on really a question about consumers, because I've just been trawling through the different questions that have been asked, and I noticed that consumers came up many times. Just, do consumers have a key role in this? And indeed, I suppose education is the other aspect. I mean, if people realise potentially that there is a lot of damage being done by using peat for horticulture, is it a case that they can transfer that to sort of consumer demand? Like I regularly had, as the political field that I was involved with, I did have people saying, what can I actually do to make a difference? And one of the things that everybody can do is they can choose what they buy, or choose what they spend their money on, or choose what sort of things they do. And I mean, if there's a bag of peat-free compost and a bag of peaty compost costing roughly the same amount of money, they can choose one rather than the other, surely. I mean, do people think that consumers really understand all this, or that it's relevant, or that they indeed can play any sort of a role? I mean, does anybody have views on that? Mark, yes, Mark and David and Ali and Diana. So maybe everybody just briefly could give us a quick view on that. Mark.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I think the RHS survey revealed that people are very unaware. I mean, half of people surveyed were unaware of what was in their bag of potting compost that they had purchased. So the importance of good labelling is the first step, but the second step, of course, is for people to read the label and to encourage them to do that, so that they are empowered to make that choice for themselves. And increasingly, they will want to do that if they are aware that their choice makes a difference to the environment, to the climate, to the future, to their children. So, yeah, I think it is an education and advice requirement that people really do look at labelling carefully and make those informed choices.
Very good. Nice. Concise answer. Thank you very much. Ali, would you like to give us your comments on that?
Thanks, Niall. Yes. When we undertook our survey of retailers, one of the things we asked about was, what are the peat-free products that you're going to be stocking? Because we wanted to be able to put that information on our website so that we could direct consumers to the right products. Something we've been told by lots of our supporters is that even if they do appreciate the importance of using peat-free, it's not always very obvious from the information on the packaging whether the product that you're looking at contains peat or not, especially when there are labels that say things like natural, organic. These are words that we would associate with it being environmentally beneficial, and yet those products could still contain peat. So it can be quite confusing for people. So we're really supportive of the idea of better labelling, so that people have a much clearer idea of what the product that they're actually buying is.
Brilliant. So clarity, again, labelling, that's obviously a key takeout from this. I mean, obviously there is labelling, but maybe perhaps it needs to be much stronger. David, do you have comments on this particular one?
Yep, agree with all of those points, really. And I think it's bringing the industry, NGOs, societies like the RHS into that messaging, and being as consistent as we possibly can, from the pack to the PR to the websites and social media. I think responsible choices as well as issues around peat. So if you ask the average consumer what is coir, would they know? So giving consumers the information to make those informed, responsible decisions, not only about buying it, but also about using it as well. So I think Steve in his presentation alluded to growing media, which at the moment includes peat, being used as a soil improver. Is that sort of behaviour change on how the product is used responsibly as well as chosen? I think that's got a role to play as well.
You don't think things like health warnings on cigarette packets might be brought in? You know, that this peaty compost can seriously damage your planet or something like that might.
Well, no, I wouldn't, Neil, and I'd be very worried about that, because I think one thing that I'd hope we'd all agree on is that gardening is a very, very rewarding pursuit for health, happiness, and the environment. And I think it'd be an absolute tragedy for the nation were gardening to be deemed as environmentally damaging. I think that'd be a loss for everybody. And it's frankly, it's why it's so incumbent on us to do the right thing, so we don't get to that point.
Yeah. Okay. So we wouldn't equate smoking, or human health with the the use of peaty compost, obviously. Diane, yeah. Would you like to make a point?
Yeah, just to say, we've been trying really hard in our group to communicate with users of the garden centres, but the garden centres have not been very responsive at all, and they didn't want us to give leaflets. In fact, one of our person who was giving leaflets outside a big retailer was asked to move on. So getting information to the people who are just buying it because it's easy and they don't know any different is challenging, getting that message across. And they might not listen to Gardener's World. Those are the sort of people, because it's just getting people to do that behavioural shift. It's inconvenient to do it, to make your own, and it's inconvenient to have to think about, and it's, as many things are to do with climate change and mitigation, we've got to do the inconvenient thing, which is look carefully and think, is there another way of doing this? So I actually would be for, I've actually made one, buying this peat can damage the environment sign.
Okay.
Yeah. So I agree with you.
Right. No, well, I was only asking the question. I'm not proposing it as the ultimate solution, but I mean, obviously we need to come to a consensus on this. What I'm going to do actually is I'm going to leave that as the last word to you, Diane. And I just want to thank the panel. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but hopefully we paraphrased them quite well and addressed most of the important issues. I'd just like to thank our panel tremendously. Jenny Hawley from Plantlife, Paul Alexander from Bulrush Horticulture. We had David Denny, Futures and Sustainability Manager with the Horticultural Trades Association. We had Steve Harper, who couldn't join us on the panel, from Southern Trident. We had Mark Gush, who's the Head of Environmental Horticulture from the Royal Horticultural Society. Mark Gush, I've mentioned Mark. Ali Morse, the Water Policy Manager with the Wildlife Trusts, and Diane Sammons from For Peat's Sake. So a wonderful panel, a wonderful discussion. I personally would like to carry on right into the small hours, and I wish we could all go away and have a nice cup of tea or something slightly stronger than that, but unfortunately it's online. So listen, it's been a pleasure, everybody, today. Thank you very much indeed, and hopefully the rest of the conference goes as well as this particular session did. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to you, Neil.
Thank you.